Okay, hello and welcome everybody to our class today on the storied life of Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetzky. I think you've probably heard the name before. You might have even heard some stories about him in the past. And I'll just give you just a quick synopsis of some of the stories you already probably heard, because I'd like to tell you other stories today, but I want to have a base here. One of the things you probably remember hearing about him is that he was kind to everybody. He was just had a smile on his face. And a story Rabbi Hollander would tell very often is that after he passed away, an older African-American lady in Muncie stopped the yeshiva student along the way, because he lived in Muncie. And she said, where's the rabbi? He said, lady, this is Muncie. There's a lot of rabbis. Can you be a little more specific? And she said, the one who always smiled, the one who always said good morning to me when he passed by. I think she was a nun even. And here's Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetzky, who you would think would never even talk to, he's such a great, famous rabbi, a Rosh Yeshiva, a Rav. And here he is, he talks to everybody. He had no preconceived notions about anybody. He was very hospitable to everyone. You've probably heard that story before, and that's the starting off point. Now, I was debating for a long time about how to best tell these stories. We could tell them thematically, stories about his wisdom, stories about his kindness, stories about how committed he was to just truth. Truth was a very important midah for him, very important characteristic. He took to heart, as we'll see in some of the stories, he took to heart the idea that he was named after Yaakov. His name is Yaakov, right? He's named after Yaakov Avinu, Yaakov, our forefather. And throughout the rabbinic writings, we know that Yaakov is known for this particular characteristic, this midah of truth, of emet. The pasuk, the verse tells us, Titein emet liYaakov, the truth was given to Yaakov. And so Yaakov Kamenetzky tried to live up to that, as we'll see in some of the stories today, lived up to that in his life as well. And so I was thinking, should I tell it thematically? Should I go in order of his life? Then I realized there's a good chance many of you don't know the basic details of his biography. So we need to either I was going to tell the biography early on and then kind of fill in the stories later on, or I think what I decided actually this morning was what we do is tell his biography, kind of important. And as we're going through the stories of his life, we'll fill in with stories as we go. God willing, we'll be able to fit all of this into 1 hour. There are a ton of stories from all kinds of sources. I have, you probably don't see them, but I have with me a good collection of books, all filled with stories about him and other teachings of his, which we will also hopefully get to. Let's start with the beginning. It's usually a good place to start. He was born in a small town in what was at that point switched hands between Poland and Russia, back and forth a few times. And the place was called Dochlinov. It's a small town. How small was it? It was so small that biographers say that for his Brit Milah, that his parents wanted to have a minyan for, they had to find a 10th person from another town to come into town so that they would have a minyan. It was that small of a town, very, very rural, very outdoorsy. And in a book written by his son about his life, written by Nathan Kamenetzky, very controversial book, by the way, called The Making of a Gadol. It's so controversial that just last week I saw somebody had it for sale. Somebody was selling it used for $500. $500. It's a very rare book. It's controversial because it was banned. It was actually, as far as I know, in Jewish history, the only book that's been banned twice. I'll explain in a moment. What happened was Natan Kamenetzky wrote this book called The Making of a Gadol, and it basically follows the life of Rav Yaakov Kamenetzky through his yeshiva years, and talks about other people as well, and the different customs in Slobodka Yeshiva, which we're going to get to, and all these other things. And it became controversial, not exactly clear why. I'll give the simplest explanation. It became controversial because some people felt that it sort of diminished the status of some of the people that are mentioned in it. These people were, they're great rabbis, and at some point, they weren't. They were little kids, and they did, they had pranks in yeshiva, and they did all kinds of different behaviors that doesn't seem like the makings of a gadol, as the book implies. This is what made him into a gadol, and made him into a great person. But not everybody felt that it did, gave the honor that was due to some of the people mentioned in the book. And I'm not gonna obviously, my 2 cents aren't even worth 2 cents when it comes to this. Much bigger people banned the book, and I don't have it available to me. It is available online in PDF form, in at least some pages, and I have some pages here with me printed. It reads very, very well. It's very academic. It's well, how do you say, annotated, a lot of footnotes, a lot of other details, and very well written. Good use of language. He calls his father the protagonist of the story. He uses good language. I approve of that, at least. My father was extremely assiduous, reviewing the Gemara and commentaries over and over until he had mastered them perfectly. Words like assiduous aren't usually used in a lot of English language Jewish books. So it was nice. It's nice, it's nice. Words like penchant, just in the same word, deciphering. All right, good use of vocabulary. I approve of that. Anyway, so for what it's worth, he writes about this, and when he writes about Dolhinov in particular, he writes, and I quote, my father, he says, developed into a robust country lad throughout his life. My father cherished his formative years in Dolhinov. He felt that by having been raised in a small town environment, he had developed a healthy outlook on life and a positive view of humanity. That's a very important thing. I don't want to wade into controversy here about this, but I have very, very strong feelings about what's called in places in New York are called the out of town community versus the in town sort of environment. I happen to think that the out of town community can very often be very, very healthy for one's midot development, for how they think about others, how they appreciate nature, and appreciate other people. It's much more friendly. I remember the first time, the first time I went to yeshiva in out of town, in what's in town, in a bigger city, bigger Jewish community, and I came out of shul and I said good Shabbos to people like we do here, yeah. So almost nobody responded to me. And they literally turned around and walked away. It was very disheartening. And I've mentioned that before, and that's exactly the kind of thing that Rav Yaakov Kamenetzky would never do. And that's probably partially, at least, because he grew up in such a place as Dolhinov, this very, very small rural community. It obviously it grew, and they had shuls, they had batei midrashim, they learned there. He obviously went to school, and at some point in his youth, it was decided that he needed to go elsewhere. He needed to go to a bigger yeshiva in a bigger town, and he went to Minsk, which is a bigger town. Where's that? So I'm trying to find the right. There are, like I said, a lot of biographies of Rabbi Yaakov, and I wanted to share some of them with you. Probably the one most people are familiar with is the Art Scroll biography. It's called Rabbi Yaakov. You see it backwards there, Rabbi Yaakov, and it's actually as it says here, it's by Yonason Rosenblum, and it's based on the research of Rabbi Nosson Kamenetzky. Where have you heard that name before, Rabbi Nosson Kamenetzky? Oh, yeah, he's the one who wrote that very controversial book that was banned 10 years ago, The Making of a Gadol. So he did more research and wrote a much thicker book. By the way, the actual book, the original version, before it was banned the first time, was 1,400 pages long. 1,400 pages long. And with footnotes and everything else, like I said. And then when it was banned, he revised it and made it much shorter. He cut out almost half of it, and it was banned again. Like I said, it was banned twice. So even that didn't seem to satisfy the community standards of certain groups. So he went to Minsk. He was like as we mentioned before, very, very, very studious there. He learned very well, and he made friends. There are obviously other people there. He learned in a very famous place, worth mentioning. It's probably deserves a class of its own. It's called Blumkas Kloisen. Blumkas Kloisen. And Blumka, as you can probably imagine just by the sound of it, is a woman's name. And that's because the entire yeshiva, the entire yeshiva katana there, was sponsored by this famous woman. Was started by her, and it was funded by her quite a bit. And her name was Blumka, and Klois is basically like a school, and it was her school. And she made a point to make sure that the next generation would have great students. So Rev Yaakov was there, and other people were there. Rev Aaron Cutler, who would later start Lakewood. Rav Reuven Grozovsky. A lot of famous rabbis were there, and they became all very good friends. And then they went to a much bigger yeshiva, the yeshiva of Slobodka, which you probably heard of. The Alter of Slobodka was the Rosh Yeshiva, sometimes called the Saba of Slobodka, of Nosson Tzvi Finkel. And he was very much into Musar. Now, before we go too far, we've already missed a very important story. Before he even went to Minsk, I knew I'd get out of sync here at some point. Before he even went to Minsk, while he's still in Dolhinov, while he was still in sort of elementary school, a very important event happened in his life, and it's told in different ways in different contexts. So I'd like to share with you how it's told in Miriam Adahan's "Raising Children to Care: A Jewish Guide to Child Rearing." So this is a book I was looking through when we were talking about in the Jewish life cycles class. We were talking about raising children and education and things like that. So this story is in that book, and it's in the Rabbi Yaakov book. It's in the Making of a Gadol book, and it's told differently in different places. And another biography, which we'll get to shortly. It says in his late 80s, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetzky said that he never forgot the shame of being slapped at the age of 5 by his teacher, because he was late to cheder, he was late to school. Now, there's details to this. The reason he was late, by the way, was because he stayed up late learning. And he had been on, it says here, he had been on his way to school when a man rushed up to him and told him that the moel for the Brit, which was about to take place, had failed to show up, and would the boy please find another. So he, as a 5-year-old, went and found another moel for Brit Milah. So that's why he was late to school. And it happened to be that same day was a holiday in the Greek Orthodox Church, which is the church of that was the Christianity that was around in Russia. So when he came to school late, the teacher thought that he was late because he was hanging out, looking at watching the parades and the festivities of the holiday. So he was so upset with Rabbi Yaakov that he slapped him. Rabbi Yaakov said the child did so, and then he rushed to school. When he finally got to his classroom and told the teacher why he was late, the Rebbe said he was lying, and he hit him. Rabbi Kamenetzky says he had never forgot the pain and humiliation of that incident for his whole life. And he continues and says, and that's what it says in that book, but it says in other books that the lesson he learned is twofold. So there's more to the story. Give me a sec. So he learned a very important lesson. First of all, he learned that his teacher didn't really know him very well, because he says he never lied. Remember, that was what he said. Or that's what he was very proud of, his name, Yaakov. He was a man of truth. He knew that he would never be a liar. He would never tell a lie. And in fact, we're going to have lots of stories later on where his truth and his dedication to truth posed quite a few difficulties, and he held to it anyway. So that was one of his lessons in truth, is that the teacher didn't know that he never lied. And what kind of teacher is that? A teacher, he says, should always know the characteristics of a student. This should never ever happen that somebody's slapped for something that's untrue. And so he was a person who never lied. So then actually, then later on, when he went to Minsk, before he even went to Slobodka, he maybe was already in Slobodka. He had to stay at a particular family for Pesach, and he wasn't sure if he can trust their kashrut. You might have heard the story before. He wasn't sure if he can trust their kashrut. He saw something that I'm not really sure what the details are. He never really said. But something happened that he didn't know if they were as meticulous about kosher as he'd like. So when they wanted to serve food, he said that he didn't eat gebrachts. Right, Pesach's coming up in about 90 days. Not to scare anybody. And what's gebrachts? So gebrachts, not 90 days. What am I talking about? It's 60 days, 2 months. All right. So So tonight is Purim Katan. Right. Next month at this time would be Purim, and the month after that is Pesach. Anyway, so gebrachts is the eating of matzah that's cooked into something else. So like matzah balls, or whatever, matzah meal cakes, whatever it is. So the Hasidim don't eat gebrachts, and Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetzky is not Hasidic. But since he said that he doesn't eat gebrachts, for the rest of his life he wouldn't eat gebrachts, because he said it. If he said it, it's true. He made it tonight. He made a deal with himself. He made a promise to himself that he would never eat gebrachts, because he said he wouldn't eat gebrachts. So that's the kind of way, that's the kind of dedication to truth that Rabbi Yaakov was famous for. So trying to find the right pages in these books here. The war started. World War I started, and here he is in Russia, and he's in yeshiva, and war is a difficult time for everybody, but in particular for the Jews, especially this mid-war between World War I and World War II, is a very difficult time for Jews in yeshivas, especially in Russia. There was the Yevsektia, which is the Russian Jewish communists who tried to get on the good side of the Gentile communists by trying to convince them to close down yeshivas, right? And to try to force the yeshivas to change their curriculum to teach more secular subjects. They're dedicated communists. They were atheists mostly, and they thought that all of this Talmudic learning and all that stuff was unnecessary, and they should probably spend more time learning, the sciences and math and things like that. So that's something called the Yevsektia. So yeshivas were closing left and right. That's actually what closed one of the major yeshivas of the world, the first major yeshiva of the world that you've heard of before, probably the one that was started by Chaim Volozhiner, the Volozhiner yeshiva, right? The famous yeshiva of Volozhin was eventually closed because of this efforts of the Russian, actually Jewish communists, to try to incorporate more secular studies in the yeshiva. So he's a man of I'm not exactly sure the exact age, maybe early 20s, maybe even younger, and he's caught between the war, and he has to go from place to place, and he has to find work, and eventually he ends up in a town. I'll try to find the name of it. Don't have the name offhand. Yeah, Lomza. I think Lomza or not. Sorry, give me a second. Oh, sorry, no, Kremenchug. No wonder I couldn't remember. Kremenchug. Okay, so he ends up in a place called Kremenchug, and I wanted to share with you, if I may, a picture of him around this time. Right. So that's Rabbi Yaakov around that time, about that age, and he goes to Kremenchug, and there's a family that needs a tutor to teach their son the alphabet. This is ABCs. So here's this huge Talmudic scholar who's been in Slobodka and other yeshivas too by now, and he's asked to teach alphabet. So he says, okay, I need a job. So that's what he's doing. He's teaching alphabet. But before he starts teaching, the parents of the kid give him a whip. Said, our kid probably going to need this. There you go. So what did Rabbi Yaakov do with the whip? He hung it on the wall. He says, I don't have any use for this. So after a few weeks of doing this, the parents find out that the child has never been whipped in school. Like, what kind of teacher is this? He doesn't seem to care about our kid at all. He's not whipping him at all. What's wrong with this teacher? So they took him to the rabbi of the town of Kremenchug to see if maybe they should fire him. Maybe the rabbi can knock some sense into him. He's got to learn how to use the whip properly. He's going to teach our kid to be a weakling and not care about his studies. We don't need that. Sorry, I'm trying to get back to that picture. That's the one. So the rabbi interviews him, and he realizes that this is not an ABC teacher. This is not an alphabet teacher. This is a scholar of huge potential. And he's like, this is not the job for you. So he convinces him to take a job as a rav, as a rabbi. And he becomes the rabbi of a town, and it's a very poor town. And for years and years, he's the rav. He starts having a family. He's in this town, and for a long time, it's just not able to sustain him. They love him. He loves being the rav. He has a congregation. He gives speeches. He teaches. He does whatever rabbis are supposed to do. I don't know if he does Zoom classes, but that's he's probably not up to that technology. But he didn't need to. So over time, what happens is he needs to move on. His family encourages him, try to move on, try to get another job as a rav of a bigger town. And he has some potential, and of course, he has some connections. He's been to big yeshivas, so he has friends. There's the Rosh Yeshiva of the time, one of the big Rosh Yeshiva of Mordechai Epstein, speaks on his behalf to try to get him a job. And what happens is that the town, I don't want to mention the name, but the town that he applied does not accept him. And he is forced through the tears of his family, he is forced to uproot himself and go to America and try to find a job there. And he's like, this is terrible. You have to understand what the reputation America had at the time was. Basically, it was a no man's land. There was no Torah. They considered it the desert. There's hardly, there wasn't no Torah. There was very little Torah, very few yeshivot. A lot of people came to America to escape Judaism, as you might have noticed. And if you've ever seen Fiddler on the Roof, like the whole last scene is, we'll go to America. We won't have to worry about any of this stuff anymore. So so that was what America was thought of at the time. And there's rumors that people like threw their tefillin into into right off the boat as they're going into Ellis Island. I'm not sure that's true, but
What year was this?
in the in the late 1800s to early 1900s. I forgot to mention when he was born, which is ironic because there's a reason why I'm giving class now at Rabbi Yaakov of all things. He was born on the 21st of Adar Rishon in 1891. Right. So today is the 15th of Adar Rishon. So within a week will be his birthday, and about a week later will be his yahrzeit. He passed on the 30th of Adar, again Adar Rishon, and the first Adar, in March 10th, 1986. So he lived almost 100 years. But we'll get to all that later. So this is now the 1920s, about 30 years old, and he comes to America and just looking for a job as a Rav, and he finds a job as a Rav in a little city named Seattle, which is why I'm wearing my Seattle tie. Now, he's there for only a year. He was not very popular, not well liked for whatever reason. It's not clear why. But this job in Seattle saved his life. Why? Because the town that he had, the town that he had been, where he was about to become the Rav, but did not get the job. That town, as we know, like many towns in Poland and Russia, were basically wiped out by the Nazis and their collaborators when they went through it, and including the Rav who got the job instead of Rav Yaakov Kamenetzky. So if Rav Yaakov would have stayed there, so as sad as they were that they were leaving Europe and coming to America and everything else, it ended up being for the best for them. And after a year of being in Seattle, he gets another much better job as being a Rav in a much bigger town called Toronto. Yes, he goes to Toronto, Canada, where he becomes a Rav for several years. And one of my favorite stories about Rabbi Yaakov happens in Toronto. He gets there and he's a Rav. And by the way, as we know, as I've mentioned before, he's dedicated to truth. But besides being dedicated to truth, he has like sort of a sensibility, like common sense was very important to him. And there was a rumor that was started around after World War II. In the mid-1940s, there was a rumor that was started that Mashiach was coming. Mashiach is coming. And a letter went out to all of the Jewish storekeepers in Toronto that if they close their shops for one Shabbat, they don't keep their store open on Shabbat, which they're not supposed to do, Mashiach will come and everything will be good. So Rav Yaakov Kamenetzky does something that nowadays, if he would have done it, he might end up on some rabbi's blacklist. He wrote a letter to all of the storekeepers. He didn't say specifically, keep your store open on Shabbat, but he told them basically ignore that letter and do what you've been doing. So it sounds like, Rabbi Yaakov, what are you doing? You could have had all these people keeping Shabbat, at least for 1 week. Wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't that be a beautiful mitzvah? Everybody's keeping Shabbat. Isn't that wonderful? So you know what he said? Brilliant. This is, if there's no other story you remember from the stories we tell tonight, if you remember this story, you'll know everything you need to know about Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetzky. He said two things. What if Mashiach doesn't come? Now we believe Mashiach can come any moment. But what if these storekeepers keep the Shabbat and Mashiach doesn't come the next day? What's going to happen to their faith? These store owners, the only thing they might have left of their Judaism is their belief that Mashiach is going to come. And if he doesn't come, as your letter promised, they're going to lose their little connection to Judaism. And what benefit is that? What benefit is that? So this is the common sense kind of thinking that Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetzky would continue to have throughout his life. Many stories like that we could share. He was a posek eventually. He wrote he paskin, he wrote halacha literature, and amongst other things, he was asked for his opinion about the wording of the Shemona Esrei. In the Shemona Esrei, there's a line that's added during certain seasons, Mashiva Ruach Umarid, and then the next word is a matter of controversy, whether you're supposed to say Marid Hageshem or Marid Hagashem. You remember this? So we talk about this always like Sukkot time when we start saying this. So Mashiva Ruach Umarid Hageshem means Hashem makes the winds blow and brings the rain. So this is in the rainy season, we start saying this line, and the second blessing of Shemona Esrei. And there's a question about how to pronounce that last word, Geshem or Gashem. What's the difference? So as anybody who's familiar with grammar might tell you, Hebrew grammar that is, it depends on if it's the end of the sentence or not. If it's the end of the sentence, it would be Gashem, because that's the way, like Hagafen is the end of the bracha for grape juice or wine, right? Hagafen, not Hagefen, as opposed to other people who like Sephardim who say very pre Hagefen. Ashkenazim say Hagafen because that's grammatically how you would end a sentence. Why Sephardim say Geshem? It's not the time for that. So what's the correct answer? So Rav Moshe Feinstein, who was a friend of Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetzky, there's a lot of pictures and videos. In fact, I'm going to share with you. First of all, I wanted to share with you a quick video of him speaking. This is in 1984. So this is 2 years before he passes. So this is basically what he looks like when he's speaking. At least in 2 years before he passes, he's a lot weaker than he used to be. But I also wanted to share with you a video of him with Rav Moshe Feinstein in 1969 in Camp Shraga. So let me try to find a good clip of the video. That's them learning together, talking together. They were very good friends. They spent a lot of time learning together, talking together, making decisions together. So Rav Moshe Feinstein in Igrot Moshe paskind that the correct pronunciation is Hagashem. Why? Because he said it's the end of a sentence. Mashiva Ruach Umarid Hagashem. So you put a period, and then you start the rest of the blessing. There are other opinions who said it's not the end of the blessing; it's actually the middle, and you should put a comma. Mashiva Ruach Umarid Hageshem, Mechalkel Chayim Bechesed, etc., etc. And that is one particular halachic opinion that it continues. So what kind of halachic opinion would you? This is the Rebbitzins, by the way. What kind of halachic opinion would you expect from Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetzky, who's common sense? So he says it depends. Depends on if you're pausing or not. If you pause there and you're making it the end of a sentence, so it's Mashiva Ruach Umarid Hagashem. But if you're not going to pause, if it's a continuation of the next blessing is a continuation of it, just Mashiva Ruach Umarid Hageshem, comma, Mechalkel Chayim Bechesed, comma. So it would be Geshem. And that's how he would paskin in general. But more importantly, what he said was, and this is a real clear Rabbi Yaakov thinking right here. He said, it also depends on that particular prayer. Like it doesn't really matter what your custom is. If you pause there because for whatever reason you stopped there, so you're taking a breath, or you decided to pause there, your prayer that time could be Hagashem. And your next time you pray could be Hageshem, because you're not pausing. So it really depends on how you're saying it. So that kind of common sense sort of way of thinking is very important for Rav Yaakov Kamenetzky.
Sorry, what's the picture supposed to be showing? Because I just see 4 rabbis.
Oh, so what you see here,
You were saying there's Rebbitzin in there?
Yes, yeah, I can't see it either. I wasn't sure if it was just me.
Sorry, yeah, this is Camp Shraga in 1969, and a lot of the video was Rav Yaakov Kamenetzky with Rav Moshe Feinstein.
No, we just see the video. We just see the picture of the
Oh, you don't,
like what it was before. We never saw the thing. Well,
Oh, you
I
don't see the
thought you
video.
were.
That's interesting.
I thought you were getting the video.
Oh,
I
oh, oh,
wasn't
oh,
sure.
oh. I see. I'm sharing the wrong thing. Give me a second.
No problem. I was just like, you said Rebbitzins, and I was like,
Yeah.
there are no
Okay. I
Rebbitzins in
see.
there.
I see. Give me a moment.
Unless someone's
I
trying to
got
change.
this. I got this. I got this. All right, here we go. Now you see video, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that. Let's see. Let's get back to the picture of them learning together. That's them learning together. And then in a few minutes, you'll see, in a few moments, you'll see the Rebbitzins. All right. So sorry about that. Technology. Yeah, that's the Rebbitzins. Okay. Told you. Okay, so in terms of Rabbi Kamenetzky, it is recorded in his biography that he was, quote, able to help a person break a question down into its component parts and strip away all his subjective biases. He would elicit all the conflicting considerations that had given rise to the quandary and then help the person look at both sides from the perspective of someone not entangled emotionally. He once told a grandson, the part of his ability to help people was that he forced himself not to let their problems become his own. He maintained sufficient emotional distance to be able to give them an objective perspective, even while radiating warmth and comfort and concern. He did not tell the person, do this, but gently guided him with the phrases like, maybe you could think about this, or perhaps you could do this. At the end of the subtle process, the person seeking his advice frequently saw things so clearly he felt the solution was his rather than Rabbi Yaakov's. This sort of reflective and empowering approach is something that I wish more people would have. And instead of like a top-down sort of answer, do this because that's the right thing to do, sort of make it true for the person to realize that the answer is within themselves. You know, all truth is there. You have the answer. The answer to your questions. You usually know the answer. You're just doubting whether, maybe it's this, maybe I'm wrong about that. And that's one of the things that Rabbi Yaakov was able to do, was he was able to show people through conversation what the best phrase would be, what the best answer would be. Let's see if I can find. I know I'm not sharing anything yet. You don't have to tell me. So a lot of the information that I'm getting today, let's see if I can do this properly. A lot of the information that I'm getting, that I'm using in today's class, comes from a podcast that I like to listen to, called Jewish History Sound Bites. And they had an interesting class a few years ago called Wisest of Men, Stories of Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetzky. And so a lot of the stories that I'm sharing with you today are stories from there, but also other sources. On the subject of his Rebbitzin, since we got a chance to see her, at least, his Rebbitzin was somebody he trusted very much. Obviously, he loved her very much. He spent a lot of time with her, and one of the interesting stories I remember hearing about them from a long time ago, something that I took to heart, is that when his Rebbitzin would clean the house for Pesach, he would hardly check the room after her. He wouldn't have to. Why? Because why should he? She cleaned the room. He trusts her cleaning, right? Is it like when we check a room for chametz before Pesach, right? Is it like just a ritual we're going through, or is it a practical need to do it because we're not sure if we cleaned well? Well, Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetzky trusted his Rebbitzin to clean so well that he didn't need to really check the room afterwards. This is mentioned, by the way, in the Haggadah of the Rosh Yeshiva, the first volume, where it lists the different customs of the Rosh Yeshiva. It's interesting that in volume 2 and volume 3 of that series, they have other Rosh Yeshiva, they don't mention the customs. So it might be that they didn't want people to learn from their customs so much. I'm not sure. Another custom of his related to holidays is a custom he had we've mentioned before in our Hanukkah class. When it came to Hanukkah, he would give gifts to his children, usually money, actually always money, and he would always do it on the fifth night. Why the fifth night? So people come up with different answers. Maybe it's because everybody wants to give it on the first night, and by the eighth night you don't even care it's Hanukkah anymore. Or maybe the eighth night is it's Zot Hanukkah, all the lights are lit, and then so he didn't want to take away from the first night, he didn't want to take away from the last night, so he gave it in the middle on the fifth night. But there's another very practical answer to why he did this, and this is that practical Rabbi Yaakov that I wanted to mention. It's the fifth night of Hanukkah. It's the only night of Hanukkah that can never be on Shabbat. You do the math and you plot Hanukkah whenever it can fall out. It can never fall out in a way that the fifth night would be Shabbat. So that way his family always knew that on the fifth night of Hanukkah, no matter what else was going on, that's the night that they would get gifts. They had something to look forward to. They didn't think, oh, maybe this year it's going to be the fourth night. Maybe we'll be surprised and it'll be the sixth night. Maybe he forgot and it'll be the seventh night. No, it's consistent. His family knew, and that way they had this kind of shows how much concern he had for that sort of thing. He became, after a while of being a Rav in Toronto, he became, and from most of the rest of his life, he was the Rosh Yeshiva of Torah V'dat, right? Rosh Yeshiva of Torah V'dat, and he was the Rosh Yeshiva before Rav Gedalia Shor, my Rosh Yeshiva's father, and he was and Rav Gedalia Shor was before Rav Belsky, right? So this is Torah V'dat, very big yeshiva in New York. Another biography I'm using for some of the stories here is something called 5 Great Lives, as a Stipler, and the second rabbi here that they have a quick biography of is Rav Yaakov Kamenetzky, and he became the Rosh Yeshiva there because he met Rav Shraga Feivel Mendelovich, who basically started that yeshiva, started another yeshiva in Monsey, Bet Medrash Gavoa, and they became fast friends, and he saw Rav Mendelovich saw the potential in Rav Yaakov, and encouraged him to join Torah V'dat as a teacher, and eventually became the Rosh Yeshiva there. So just a moment. Oh boy. Okay. As Rosh Yeshiva, obviously, it's a different kind of job. It's a very different kind of career being Rosh Yeshiva. You're fundraising a lot, you're teaching a lot. It's not the same thing as being a Rav. I heard that his grandson once asked him, which were you more? Were you more the Rav, or you're more the Rosh Yeshiva? What role did you really connect with the most? The rabbi of a synagogue or the Rosh Yeshiva of an institution? So he said his whole life he felt like he was a Rav. He was a rabbi. He had congregants. So even his students, in a sense, became almost like his congregants in a way. As we described how he guided everybody and he taught them. That was a very important aspect of his life. Eventually, after being Rosh Yeshiva for many, many years, he retired and he moved to Monsey. And in Monsey, basically, his semi-retirement. Actually, I wanted to share one other story about Torah V'dat that you can find in the Rav Belsky biography. So, in the Rav Belsky biography, right, he was the Rosh Yeshiva afterwards. So during his years in Torah V'dat Beit Medrash, he grew close to the Gadol who was to become his primary Rebbe in Hashkafa and Dat Torah. Hashkafa means philosophy. Dat Torah means your perception of Torah. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetzky became a Magid Shiur, basically taught a class in Torah V'dat in 1945. and later served as its Rosh Yeshiva. His Torah knowledge, combined with rare insight and practical wisdom, made him one of the leading Torah personalities of his time. This is what Rav Belsky wrote about Rabbi Yaakov when he passed in 1986. He says, I wish to stress that each of Rabbeinu's Talmidim, that means each of Rabbi Yaakov's students, felt that his way of relating to them was like a father to his only child. When he counseled the Talmud, he divested himself of all other matters and turned his full attention to the Talmud, to the student. With the light of his clear intellect, he saw deep into the inner chambers of the Talmud's heart, feeling his pain and worrying about his future success. He had thousands of such only sons. Among them were leaders in the community, common laborers, brilliant Talmidei Chachamim and laymen, Hasidim, Misnagdim, representatives of every tribe in Klal Yisrael. Everyone valued his every word as if the voice of the Shekhinah was emanating from within him. Regarding every important topic, people would ask, what does Rabbi Yaakov say? Have you heard anything in his name? If you are certain that this is what he said, then this is what must be done. Rabbi Belsky continues, he says, I recall when I merited to be with him in the last Knesset Gedolah, which was held in Jerusalem. This was in 1980. Rabbi Yaakov was then 90 years old. He went to Israel for this big meeting of some of the big rabbis. Crowds of our brethren in the Holy Land surrounded him and gazed upon him with awe as they asked, is this the Hakima the Yehudi, the wise one amongst the Jews? That's what they used to call him. Whose words are accepted by all Klal Yisrael. Far be it for me to evaluate the greatness of Rabbeinu, for I am but dust beneath the soles of his feet. So that's how Rav Belsky writes about Rav Yaakov Kamenetzky. So like I said, after being Rosh Yeshiva for many years, he retired and moved to Monsey. And in Monsey, where he was, I want to say, semi-retirement, because he spent much of his time actually writing his books. A lot of his books were published either during his lifetime or posthumously, like this book, Emet Yaakov, as implied by his desire for truth, right? The Truth of Yaakov is the title of the book, which we quote very often in our Parsha classes. Almost once a week, or at least once every few weeks, we have something from Yaakov Kamenetzky, because he has such brilliant, very insightful things to say. We've mentioned him in the context of he sort of stepped in when the Rambam and the Ramban argue about whether witchcraft is real, whether it actually works, whether you can do magic. So Rav Yaakov Kamenetzky pipes in and gives his opinion. The hour is getting late, so we don't have time for that right now. He talks about in why Moshe Rabbeinu had to keep kosher. Right, we know the famous story. The Midrash tells us, the Gemara tells us even that Yocheved was able to raise Moshe because he wouldn't nurse from the Egyptians. Why wouldn't he nurse from the Egyptians? Because he would someday, teach Torah. So is that true? Is that a halacha? That you're not allowed, you're allowed to nurse from a non-Jew, and the halacha is that you are. Some of us are going to be Torah teachers also someday. Why is that okay for us? Why wasn't that okay for Moshe? So it's only, he said, that's only for Moshe. The halacha isn't a halacha. That's only for Moshe Rabbeinu. Why? Because Torah growth depends on individuals, and for us, the way that we get to become those individuals is by parents building that foundation for us. Our parents do that. So Moshe couldn't nurse from the Egyptians, not because they were Egyptians, because they were Gentiles, but because he needed to be around his parents. And his parents were going to mold him into the person who he became. That's how he explains that Midrash, which explains a lot about his educational philosophy too, doesn't it? He realizes how important it is to be around the people that we have in our lives. Now, when he was in Monsey, he was not far away from what would eventually become my yeshiva. I went to yeshiva in Or Sameach, Monsey, which that used to be, and unfortunately no longer around. And the Menal there of Rabbi Braun would tell us stories about he would bring Talmidim, he would bring students to Rabbi Yaakov. Sorry, give me one moment. It's not easy to share things. He would bring Talmidim to Rabbi Yaakov, and oh, I can do it like this. I got this. Don't worry. He'd bring students to him, and they would ask questions, and he gave them all the time in the world. Now, remember, these students were more or less what we call Bali Teshuva, and they weren't always the greatest scholars. And he would speak to them in Torah. He would try to encourage them. And one of the things that Rabbi Braun remembers him asking, he said in Pirkei Avot, it tells us, Aseh lecha rav. Aseh means to force, like make for yourself, force yourself to have a rabbi. Why is that so important? So he said, sorry?
Over the school event, point.
So why is that so important? So he would say that, 1 second. I'm just trying to share as many pictures as I can with you. Yeah, that's a picture of him with his son, Shmuel Kamenetzky, who's Rosh Yeshiva now, and in Philadelphia, I believe. So there's a verse in Devarim. It says, "Ish kol hayasher be'einav." Everyone does what's right in their own eyes. So if you're only going to do what you think is right, you're always subjective. So you have to have a rav. You have to have some sort of direction. You need to have a rabbi who's going, or some sort of dat Torah, some sort of a Torah source that's going to always direct you into the good path. Now, obviously, such people as Rabbi Yaakov are going to have an impact. And oh, there's one other quick story I wanted to share with you that I saw online recently. Let's see if I can share this easily. Right. Okay, I got this. So he's so that's not it. And that's it. This is an article that was written, I believe, in Mishpacha magazine for the Record, issue 886. It says it's in response to an article written about Rav David Leibowitz, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of Chafetz Chaim. So it says here, a number of years ago, I heard the following story from Rav Binyamin Kamenetzky, the son of Rabbi Yaakov. It gave me the insight into Rav David's greatness, like how great another rabbi is. So this is a story about how much respect Rav Yaakov had for another rabbi. So when he arrived, the young Rav Binyamin was taken aback by the very less than adequate material environment and provisions. The beds in the dormitory were literally touching each other side by side because there was almost no extra floor space. The menu consisted of soup and day-old bread. Rav Binyamin sent a letter to his father and complained, "For this, I could have stayed in Europe." Right? In Europe, it was pretty bad. And now you're taking me to America and you're sending me to this yeshiva where like it's pretty bad here. So if Yaakov sent a costly express letter, that means like almost overnight. This is before overnight letter, right? Very costly, cost a lot of money, with the following message: Rav David is such a great man that if I were a gevir in Europe, if I was a rich man in Europe, I would have sent you to America to learn from him. All right? So that's how much respect he had for other teachers of Torah, especially Rav David Leibowitz. And one last story I'd like to share with you. All right, let me give you two more stories. I think I have time. Two more stories. One story is current, and one story happened at another wedding. There was a chatan who was about to get married, and he had a Rosh Yeshiva, but his family was close to Rav Moshe Feinstein. This is already in the 80s. Moshe Feinstein's an older man. And he asked Rav Moshe Feinstein to be the Mesader Kedushin, to be in charge of the wedding, to marry him, to be under the chuppah, etc., etc. Moshe Feinstein said, of course, it's a great honor. I'll do it. Usually, by the way, the custom is to ask the Rosh Yeshiva. In this particular case, he didn't ask his Rosh Yeshiva. He asked one of the biggest rabbis of the generation, if not the biggest, Rav Moshe Feinstein. So he asked Rav Moshe Feinstein, and Rav Moshe Feinstein said, sure. And then later on, closer to the wedding, Rav Moshe Feinstein started not feeling so well. And his Rebbetzin Feinstein said, there's no way I'm going to let him do this. He's not going to be the Messiah Kedushin. I'm sorry. So the Chatan said, okay, I'll ask my Rosh Yeshiva. He went and asked the Rosh Yeshiva. The Rosh Yeshiva said, I'm sorry. I already made other plans. I didn't know that you'd needed me for this. I made it. I'm sorry. So the Chatan didn't know what to do. He didn't have his Rosh Yeshiva. He didn't have Rav Moshe Feinstein. What's he going to do? So he went to Rav Moshe Feinstein. He asked, what should I do? Rav Moshe Feinstein said, I have an idea for you. Ask Rav Yaakov Kamenetzky. And if Rav Yaakov Kamenetzky, tell him this whole story. And if he doesn't do it, worst case scenario, I'll do it anyway. Rebbetzin said no, but if Rabbi Yaakov says no, then I'll do it. I'll make sure you have somebody. Don't worry. So the Chatan says, okay. Asks, he doesn't know Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetzky from anything. I mean, he's heard of him. He's obviously famous, but they don't have any kind of relationship. So why would he do this, right? So he asks Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetzky, tells him the whole story. Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetzky asks him his name and location of the wedding. He says he'll be there. The Chatan gets there a few hours early to his wedding, a couple hours early for the pictures. And the only other person in the hall, besides the photographer, is Rav Yaakov Kamenetzky. Rav Yaakov Kamenetzky is there from the beginning of the wedding. And he doesn't leave until the end of the wedding. Not just the first dance, not the chuppah. He stays till the benching, till the Birkat Hamazon at the end of the wedding. And why? He eventually explained that he didn't want this groom to feel like he's imposing on somebody. Rav Yaakov Kamenetzky is there, and he'll be there the whole time. And he's honored to be there. That's the kind of concern. By the way, Rabbi Yaakov was not a young man then either, right? Rabbi Moshe passed away in the same year. I actually remember, I was not religious then, but I was here at the school, and I remember when the rabbis came in and told us that he passed away. I don't remember what they said about them, but I remember how sad they were. More importantly, I remember how anxious they were. They were like scared. Like these two great giants died within a few weeks of each other, Rav Moshe and Rabbi Yaakov. What are we going to do? How are we going to, exist with them gone? So I want to share with you a story that happened a few months ago, in November of this last year, November of last year. This is a story that happened. There's a video on Twitter. True story. And this is how we're going to live. This is how we're going to survive. Because when there's somebody like Rabbi Yaakov, his persona, and by the way, you guys see this video? Yeah? I'm sharing it correctly now? I want to make sure you see these words.
Yes.
I want to make sure you see these words. It's a beautiful story. You have to understand a little bit about yeshiva politics. I'm not going to get into great depth, but there's kind of a split between the yeshivish crowd, the more maybe called ultra-Orthodox in some circles, and the modern Orthodox. Rav Herschel Schachter, as highly respected as he was, and still is, he's a Rosh Yeshiva in YU. So he's modern Orthodox. Rav Shmuel Kamenetzky, the son of Rav Yaakov, is a Rosh Yeshiva of yeshiva, Black Hat Yeshiva, right? So he's supposedly, on the more chashuv side in those circles. Rav Schachter's grandson married the granddaughter of Rav Shmuel Kamenetzky. It's already something to talk about. At the wedding, the band started playing Yamim al Yemei Melech, famous song that's always sung for Torah scholars. And the custom in yeshivish weddings is for the Chatan at this point to dance with the Gadol, with the biggest rabbi there. So what does the grandson start to do? He starts to dance with Rabbi Yaakov's son, Rav Shmuel. And you see in this video, Rav Shmuel whispers that he should dance with his grandfather, with Rav Schachter. That's exactly what the Chatan does. He dances with his grandfather, who is in the yeshivish world not as respected. But for this boy, his grandson, he should be as respected. That's the kind of thinking, that's the kind of sensitivity that Rabbi Yaakov exhibited and that his grandsons exhibit, and that we can still learn from the stories that we hear from Rabbi Yaakov. And that was really the intent tonight, was to give you an idea, at least, into the world of Rabbi Yaakov, how he thought, the truth of him, the care and concern that he had for others, the plain caring that he had for everybody. I just yet last night I heard another story of how his grandson called a friend in Miami. Rav Yaakov Kamenetzky spent a lot of summers winters in Miami when he lived in Muncie, because it's too cold in Muncie. And he stayed in a particular hotel. And this is years and years later, 20 years later, 10 years ago, his grandson calls a friend who's staying in this hotel, and he wants to leave a message at the desk. And he says, tell him Rabbi Kamenetzky called. The lady at the desk, clearly you could tell by the voice, it was probably a Southern, African-American sounding lady. And she says, Rabbi Kamenetzky? He died many years ago. He's taken aback. How do you know? How do you know my grandfather? She says, are you related to Rabbi Kamenetzky? He says, yes. He says, we were best friends. I would always take out the lectern for him. He would give this class. He gave a Daf Yomi class from the hotel when he was in Miami. So she would bring out the lectern, and he would say, how are you? And good morning. And at the end of the day, he'd wish her well. So she remembers this name Kamenetzky from then 20 years ago. He died in 86. She still remembers the name. It's an amazing thing. We can have that kind of impact on everybody we meet, and that's what the Torah wants from us. The Torah wants us to be the Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetskys and to learn from his example. And the more we do, the greater we'll be, and the greater the world will be. I wish you all a good night and yesh koach, and we'll continue learning, God willing, Wednesday night when we learn Parsha Kitisa.
Amen.
Good night.
Thank you.
Question for Purim.
One moment.